This show has been brought to you by Smith's Detection and the National Air Traffic Controllers Association.
My voice is the voice that guides you home safely each and every day.
24 hours a day, 365 days a year.
I am the voice of the safest and most efficient airspace in the world.
I have to be 100% of the time.
I am.
I am.
I am.
I am a professional air traffic controller.
Today I'm joined in the studio by former TSA Administrator Peter Neffenger. Admiral, thanks for being here. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Todd. Always a pleasure.
All right, let me set the stage. 18 months ago, you come into office. TSA is facing a very negative, leaked DHS IG Inspector General report on screening failures. There's low morale in the agency, and it's a very difficult budgetary environment. Other than that, great time to come in. What were your kind of initial thoughts in accepting this assignment, and kind of what were you thinking you wanted to try and get accomplished?
Well, someone told me I should have checked my caller ID before I pick up the phone on this one. But actually, my first thought was, this was an agency in crisis, not just internally, but externally as well. You had a big public loss of confidence in the ability of the agency to do its job. And then people internally were just kind of hunkered down, waiting for the next incoming round to come in. So it looked like it was an interesting challenge. The fascinating thing about going into an agency at the level I did, having never worked there before, is in some ways it liberates you from being tied to any particular way of doing things. So the first thing we had to do was figure out what went wrong and get people kind of out of that hunkered down mentality and just working on a problem. So the first thing is to give them something to work on. So we started working on the root causes of the problems. And then that spurred all sorts of discoveries about things that we could do, whether with respect to training, with respect to building a culture, with respect to reconnecting ourselves to the industry that we were part of.
So a lot of people, myself included, you've heard me say this before, underestimated you and said, God, what can somebody really get accomplished in 18 months in such a big bureaucratic organization? Now you look back, you were able to put a lot of transformational change into the agency. How do you do that?
Well, I think the first thing is when you've got a crisis, that's real opportunity. And putting aside the cliche about don't let crises go to waste, what you really have is a tremendous amount of information that's been provided to you, things that haven't gone well. And if you listen to that and really dig deep into it, it gives you an opportunity to make massive change. Plus, you have an organization that's receptive to it. They don't want to be there. I can tell you, when you sit around that table for the first time and you look out at that sea of faces that are just in panic because they don't know what to do about it, then you can take advantage of that opportunity and move forward. So that's the first thing. The second is to try to discover what are the biggest levers you can pull that make the most difference in the short amount of time. Because you have to get yourself out of crisis, but you got to have a couple quick wins. Otherwise, you're just churning the organization. So we thought a couple easy quick wins were, let's retrain that frontline workforce, find out what happened, and then go back and make sure that we try to train that out. And the second thing was to look for how can you begin to transform the way we think about our interactions with the industry. It's not hard to pick up the telephone and call the CEO of an airline, call you, call other association CEOs and say, hey, what can we do better? And those little things actually begin to open a lot of doors for you going forward.
As you have the benefit of reflection now, looking back over that 18-month span of time, what are a couple of the accomplishments that you feel the greatest sense of pride about?
Well, there are really two big things. One was reconnecting our frontline workforce to the leadership of the organization. There had been a real disconnect between the transportation security officers, the uniformed workforce of TSA, and the leadership back at headquarters. Some of that is natural. It's a distributed workforce. It's out there. You don't see it every day. So it takes work, but having grown up in a military environment, you learn how to work with those disconnected, geographically remote people. So that was the first piece, and then trying to rebuild a sense of identity. That they're not just screeners. These are security professionals, and they have a really tough job. The second thing was connecting to the industry that we're really part of. TSA, I think any government agency has this tendency to kind of stand alone and just do its own thing. But TSA has a dramatic effect upon the whole system operation. And as the rest of the system was getting more efficient, whether it's through kiosks and automated bag checking and all this other business that's gone into the airline industry, TSA was still the same old analog system that we'd always been. So we became a real bottleneck in a system that was otherwise efficient. So you got to reconnect yourself to the system. So those two things, I think, reestablishing a connection to the frontline workforce, creating a training academy for them for the first time ever down in the federal law enforcement training centers, and then tying ourselves back to the industry that we are part of.
All right, fill in the blank on this one. If I was leading TSA for the next 18 months, I would continue the effort to transform the whole security environment. I think, as you know, we did a lot of work with the airlines over the past couple of years to begin to put some automated screening lanes into airports. That's just the beginning of what I think needs to be done in the entire security environment. If you look at it, we still have a checkpoint approach to security in the airports from the TSA perspective. That's okay, but that's a single point of failure potentially. So I'd like to see us distribute security throughout the entire environment. We did some work with a number of airports. Denver in particular is looking at how do you distribute security elements throughout. So you have a series of filters that become progressively more secure as you get closer to the secure area. So I would really hit that hard. And I think there's there's opportunity there, there's excitement there, and the innovation task force that we created over the past year is a potential receptacle for that kind of thinking. So that's the first thing I do. The second thing, there's some internal things. I would work on human capital management reform inside TSA, because we've got to get better at kind of a lifelong approach to how you manage capital. This is valuable resource. Sort of an internal issue, I guess, but it's an important one. TSA was stood up so quickly that you had to outsource a lot of those functions and capabilities rather than have internal resources to do that.
Yeah, and I think that some of that stuff needs to come back in-house. So that, one, it creates some ownership within the agency for the people that you're hiring, and secondly, it's more sustainable in the long run. If you've got to recompete contracts for your hiring and recruiting and so forth every number of years, there's a potential that you're going to go through a restart on a regular basis.
You use the words innovation and transformation a lot. One of the things that I found surprising and quite refreshing in your approach was exactly that. Entrepreneurialism is not something that one thinks of typically in any government agency, but particularly TSA, and you infuse the organization with a sense of entrepreneurial capability and innovation. Talk a little bit about why you think that's so important.
Well, one, I think that government at its best is entrepreneurial, and I don't think that those are contradictions in terms. And in fact, if you think about it, you really want government to be entrepreneurial. The whole experiment of government is an entrepreneurial experiment, and it continues to this day. So as you look at and then when you look at the security environment, you have to think entrepreneurial. The enemy is very entrepreneurial. They're constantly looking at ways to defeat you, whether it's through the development of devices that they can get through or through subverting the system in some way. So I like thinking of every day, what do I do differently today from what I did yesterday? And how might I change that? And who might be thinking about this with me? And so I love throwing ideas out there and moving from a static sort of approach to things to this constant evolution approach. And so creating that innovation task force was a way to, one, incubate a way of thinking. But the problem with an operating agency is that it has to do the same thing every day, it has to do something every day, it tends to do the same thing every day because you invest a lot of time and effort into training and production and operating procedures. So trying to think about how do you inject innovation and entrepreneurial thinking into it, I wanted to create like a little incubation chamber, and that's what we call the Innovation Task Force. And that incubates these entrepreneurial ideas, provides a place for the private sector to plug in, and then you can meter it in to the organization in a way that the organization can accept. So you don't drive the operators crazy on a daily basis, but you get them new stuff, and you get them thinking about how to do things differently.
So let me offer an observation as an end user and part of a constituency base for TSA. One of the things that I admired about your tenure was you really reached out and talked a lot about partnership and collaboration. And the armchair psychologist in me would say that your experience as a Coast Guard official helped in that regard. Coast Guard's used to reaching out to Congress, reaching out to other agencies, sometimes law enforcement, sometimes other military backgrounds are less collaborative and inclusive. But it made a real difference to those of us that are operating out in the system. Would you have any advice for whoever comes next in terms of partnerships?
Yeah, I'd say you can't do it without partnerships. It is a collective game. No one entity owns security in the transportation world. And in the aviation sector, you have to have the cooperation of airlines, airports, the associations that represent the airlines and airports, all the vendors that feed into that, as well as the government agencies. And TSA is not the only government agency. There are federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies. There are federal, state, and local governance entities, and so on and so forth. So if you don't tie all that crowd together, you're only touching a very tiny piece. It's sort of this illusion of control without actually having all the players involved. So the first thing is to recognize is that you have to have those partnerships, otherwise you're not going to do your job. If the mission is to secure the system, you better know who all the people are in the system, and you better work with them together. And the second thing is it's the same thing we used to talk about in the Coast Guard all the time. We're not big enough to do it all by ourselves. We used to joke in the Coast Guard that if we didn't ask for help, we'd be standing there by ourselves on the pier. So I think it's just a natural to have the partnerships. You have to, but it's not natural to seek them, because you get into your office in an agency and you just do what you do all day long, and you can get trapped by your inbox. So the other key to in my opinion, to be a successful administrator is to get your head out of the inbox and find out who's in your system with you. So that's what I did, and that's why I called you and others like you to say, hey, talk to me about what you do and how we affect what you do. What has been your experience with TSA? What would you like your experience to be with TSA? And then you can begin to work on some issues together.
Only have time for one last question. Last month you wrote and issued something you called the roadmap.
Yes.
Which was a multi-page document that, at least to me, looked like, here's what we did, here's why we did it, here's where we're headed, and here's why you should stay on this path. So talk a little bit, maybe that's right, maybe that's wrong, but
that's exactly it.
What were you trying to accomplish with that?
Well, and that's exactly what it was. That really comes from my experience in the Coast Guard for over 3 decades. Whenever I left a position, whenever others left positions, we were encouraged to just write some personal reflections on, what had we done? Particularly in the military, you tend to hold a job for anywhere from 2 to 4 years. And so you know that you're not going to hold it forever, so your job is to advance it, however much you can advance it over that period of time. And so it's helpful to sit down and say, what did I see when I got here? Why did I choose the things I did to work on? What were some of the imperatives that were there? And then more importantly, what did I do? And given what I did, what would I continue to do and what's left to be done? So that was really meant as a personal reflection from me to my successor, as well as to the incoming administration and the incoming team at the department, to say, hey, this is what I found when I got here. This was the TSA I entered into. These were my observations. Here's what I did with those observations, and these are some of the things we tackled. Here's what we got done. Here's what's left to be done. It's sort of you write a chapter, if you will, for the chapter that you held it. And then I wanted to distribute it to some key industry partners, so that you had an understanding of at least where I was coming from, and to the extent that it's helpful, you can use that in your interaction with TSA going forward.
And the biggest piece of the future that you hope TSA is able to accomplish?
Well, we've got to continue. You can never stop focusing on the mission. It's one of these things that I tell people, you'll never get it right, but you've got to pursue right every single day. And that keeps you focused. So first and foremost, focus on the mission every single day, because that's the most important thing. If that fails, it doesn't matter what all the other stuff you've wrapped around it. Second is, focusing on the mission tells you you've got to change the way we do business. So I like this transformation piece. I think that that's the key. If for no other reason, then you can't staff your way out of the kind of industry growth that we've been seeing. If it continues in the manner that it has over the past 5 years, we will rapidly run short of people again, and you'll get back to these long lines outside of checkpoints. So we got to the point where we could fully staff at the peak periods at the top 30 airports, and it dramatically improved our ability to manage the system. But we're still pretty close to capacity. And so if you have another 2.5% to 4% to 5% annual growth, depending upon where you look and whose numbers you pay attention to, then rapidly you're going to run into the same problem. So you got to retransform the system, automate it more, pull some of the stuff that we're doing in the checkpoint out of the checkpoint, connect ourselves more to the rest of the system, and then finally stay connected to the industry. It's surprising how many good ideas there are if you just start listening to people.
Well, Peter, that's all the time we have. Thank you very much for your service, not only as administrator, but for your decades of service to this country and the Coast Guard. We appreciate everything that you did.
Thanks, Todd. Well, it's been great, and it's been the privilege of my career to work with you and others like you in this industry. It's been a real blast.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
That's all. Thanks for joining us.